and newsagents.
We're joined now. Got a privilege of having the great man in the studio. He's wandered down from the third floor to our little bunker and little newsagent's bunker on the second floor.
That's
James
very
O'Brien.
nice. Well, thank you for having me.
No, not at all. This is our second round of this in 2 days. You interviewed me yesterday at the
Yes,
podcast show.
It's ridiculous.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
It's almost as if all the cliches are true about the metropolitan elite.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We should talk about your book. But first, an election was called literally yesterday. We're recording this on a Thursday. It was called unexpectedly on Wednesday. And I just thought it would be worth talking a little bit about your show, which is a phenomenon and has become a phenomenon, and it's become a staple of so many people's lives. Every time I get into a taxi or an Uber, sometimes they recognise my voice or they recognise me, and the first thing they say is, "You must know James O'Brien." Or I'm in the car and they're listening to James O'Brien. It is absolutely ubiquitous. Does your show change because of the election at all?
You've got to be conscious of purdah, haven't you, up to a point. But I don't, because I don't really have many guests.
No, I know, because I filled in for your show. And it is it's the hardest show to do on LBC, and I suspect British radio, actually.
Except I prefer it that way.
Yeah.
So it's harder in the sense that you've got to keep everything moving yourself. All the moving parts have to keep moving yourself. But the reason why it's relevant to your question is because I don't have to worry about having had a guest on from Party X, meaning I have to now have someone on from Party Y. And LBC is quite cleverly constructed in the sense that our impartiality is demonstrated over the course of the day. So you're not tied to these requirements in the way that you would be at the BBC, where each programme is going to be judged individually.
And each package.
Each package even. You have to have someone like Nigel Lawson on to counter Galileo Galilei's view of the universe. But I guess it will probably be a little less variety than usual in that every day we'll be coming back to something election related. But I enjoy that. I don't think that it will have a profound impact on sort of topic selection or getting the phones to ring.
Obviously your show really became the phenomenon it is in the Brexit years. It was the kind of
afterwards, the result,
indeed. Yeah. It was the kind of petrol on the fire, really. And you've talked about this. You talk about it in your book. You've talked about it many times. There is this slightly weird paradox with you, right? In the sense that this thing that you vehemently oppose, that you loathe, and you loathe many of the sort of progenitors of it and the people involved in it and what it's done to our country, and yet it's sort of symbiotic with you in the sense it's sort of led to, at least to some extent, to you being who you are and the phenomenon that your show is. It's two questions really. Does that trouble you? And secondly, if the kind of vanguard changes, the characters change, we have a Labour government, and if everything calms down, I don't think it will, but if it does, do you worry about that with your show?
No and yes. I don't worry about the first bit. It is what it is, as long as I'm true to myself, and as a consequence of being true to myself, I'm acting authentically and honestly. So good for business, bad for the soul. As long as you look after yourself, then the despair you feel at what's been done to our country is, I suppose, mitigated slightly by taking some pleasure in the professional success that it's brought. I worry a bit about the second question. I don't know how worried I should be, because it's not as if the days of an unleavened diet of Brexit bashing are long behind us. We haven't talked about Brexit really for a while, except intermittently.
Do you get complaints about that? People saying, "James, you've forgotten about it"?
No, I don't. I do it still do it more than anyone else.
I know. I'm an avid listener. Yeah,
I still do it more than anyone else, but I don't do it anywhere near as much as I used to. But the chaos. Sunak hasn't been that chaotic, No. So the days when you would be, I used to love seeing on Twitter people say something would happen, and people would say, "I can't wait for James in the morning," and I had that today because the general election was caused yesterday. But it struck me when I was enjoying this morning's anticipation that we haven't had that for a while. Whereas under Johnson, it was constant,
and
trust. It was and trust
briefly.
But it was wow.
Yeah.
What's he going to have to say about this, and what's he going to have to say about that? So I would hope that I've done enough to build that bond of trust, even when there's not a crash happening every day.
But you'd be moving from a situation where you basically do not respect, do not like, do not care for the politics or the politicians of the people involved, to a government, and obviously We don't know
sure
how it will pan out, but at least at the start that you have Keir Starmer more respect for and more sympathy for, and that'll change things.
It will change things, and I try not to overthink stuff in case
you've come to the wrong place.
Well, I like to be there and work out in the moment what is going to happen.
Yeah.
So it may be that I end up arguing more again. We go back to the people who'd ring me up to tell me that Brexit was brilliant, and they'll be ringing me up to tell me that Keir Starmer's a wrong un, and so there might be a little bit more of the pugnaciousness that has diminished a lot lately, or it may be that what I can't become is a cheerleader, obviously.
Yes.
Even though in my soul I sort of want to be. I really I don't care who it is. I really want someone to start the business of fixing a lot of the problems that we've been.
You respect
detailing.
Starmer, don't you?
Yeah, I do respect him,
but you must get some of your particular fans and people who follow you who are sort of, they came to you through Brexit.
Yes.
Who really dislike the fact that he was so ardently Remain and has moved on and has appeared to vacillate on at least quite a few of his principles and promises. But that doesn't bother you so much, or?
I mean, the old tension between pragmatism and power. I don't think I will sit in judgment on some of those things until he has achieved power and we begin to see what he does with it. So I can be a lot more forgiving in the pursuit of power for prioritising, pragmatism over, even perhaps over principle, but certainly over consistency. But if you do that in the exercise of power, then it's a different proposition entirely. There is a growing I think he's been very lucky as well. In the sense that people, I think Daniel Finkelstein wrote about this morning, it's just a presumption that by the time he's halfway through his first term, he will have to be recognising the ridiculousness of what Brexit has done.
Revisit the Brexit
what it has begun, if not revisit it, because I think that would be a little bit harder than he realises. But the first stage is to acknowledge it. The first stage is to acknowledge the room for improvement, and then from room for improvement you move to need for improvement, and from need for improvement you move to improvement. So there is a presumption that I share that this is it's a nettle he's going to grasp sooner rather than later, and by the time he grasps it, it won't be anywhere near as stingy as it would be if he'd done it last year or indeed last month.
Your book, in a sense, it's basically an anthology of baddies. Really. You have a chapter on each of these people, whether it's Boris Johnson or Andrew Neil or Jeremy Corbyn, Liz Truss, I think the only woman who's in it, and others as well, Murdoch. And you basically say that between them, they have in different ways polluted, ruined the body politic, our national discourse and so on. To what extent do you think it really is about these individuals and it's contingent upon them? I.e., in a way, if these people had never existed, do you think we'd be in a completely different place? Because there is a different way of kind of understanding, potentially, our journey that we've been on nationally, isn't it? Which is more about big structural forces that have been shaping the world and so on. But you've chosen to focus on individuals. Why is that?
Because they're representatives, aren't they, I think? And they're representatives, with the exception of Corbyn, of three engines of change. So, I mean, I don't know what starting point you prefer. Every reader prefers a different starting point, but Murdoch getting hold of the Sun, but then Murdoch getting hold of the Times in slightly suspect circumstances where Margaret Thatcher worked quite hard to make sure he could get hold of it.
Largely forgotten now, but it was very big at the time.
Yeah, but changing the minister responsible for deciding whether or not he would be allowed it from someone hard to someone soft. And then the Hillsborough front page, which actually writing the book, I found myself, and it's not the first time I've included that in a book, but the Hillsborough front page, it affects me in all sorts of ways. My father was a newspaper journalist.
Truth.
Yeah, when Kelvin Mackenzie put a blatant lie that danced on the graves of dead children, and he stuck it on the front page knowing it was a lie, and Murdoch never cautioned him or disciplined him. He suffered no professional consequences or personal consequences because he'd still be invited onto TV shows. I may, in retrospect, be over-egging that particular pudding, but that seems to me a profoundly significant moment in the decline of my dad's profession, my late father's profession, print journalism, where there was a decency or at least a a pitch everyone played on, abiding by the same rules, even if they were playing for different teams. So the three engines are represented by the individuals. This iteration of the Tory party, the sort of post-Brexit iteration of the Tory party, the rabid right-wing media that has grown up in a space that meant there was no room here for Fox News because we already had the Daily Mail. That those appetites were already being fed, and then these dodgy lobby groups that call themselves think tanks never reveal who funds them, and yet have managed to infiltrate every level, first of the media and subsequently of the Conservative Party. So I see it, and some of it's accidental, some of it's deliberate, some of it's personal vendetta. Dacre's psychodrama about hating absolutely everybody who made him aware of his own myriad inadequacies should never have been allowed to play out on the national stage.
So you would say some of it is personal in the book, but actually it's actually you wanted to settle some scores in effect, or at least set the record
on a personal level, but
yeah.
on a national level. It's a patriotic book, mate. It's a book that comes from a love of Britain and a hatred of what's being done to it. And you think of three Paul Dacre front pages, and what they say about what had happened to public discourse and the body politic. You've got Enemies of the People, which is an attack upon the independent judiciary because that man didn't like the judgment, and by then he had so much power that he was able to call judges enemies of the people. That's the language of 1930s Germany. There's no two ways about it. And then he could say, crush the saboteurs, and he could say that about elected parliamentarians who were not prepared to go along with Boris Johnson's nonsensical inflation of the idea of a no-deal Brexit. And then you had our Remainer universities, which is an attack upon academic freedom, I mean, in its purest form. So three of the most fundamental platforms of British democracy coming under attack from a man, more than an organ, but from a man who saw himself as a champion of British values, and by then exercised so much influence over the public, yes, through the readership, but over the Tory party, through their terror of coming out on the wrong side, of not getting a front page like Steel of the New Iron Lady for Theresa bloody May. And the detachment from reality was complete, but the indulgence of personal vendetta, personal moral corruption and personal bitterness was absolutely epic.
What was the process for you deciding on who would be in and who wouldn't be in? Because there must have been some near misses.
Not really.
Oh, really?
They're nearer misses now. So once I'd identified those three engines, the candidates presented themselves pretty easily. I suppose for people who haven't read the book, Andrew Neil might be a surprise.
Yeah, that's the one that surprised me. I mean, I know you're not a fan, but it surprised me that you would necessarily put him in that pantheon of people who broke Britain.
Well, he introduced think tanks into the British media. He was essentially the first person to give the Institute of Economic Affairs the utterly undeserved importance that it needs in order to become, an incubator of prime ministers or an influencer of public discourse. He put a bloke called Charles Murray all over the Sunday Times, who was essentially a eugenicist who thought that single mothers should have their babies taken away from them. And that is a beginning of a process of making disgusting positions respectable, of which he was a big part. He was also, of course, part of the breaking of the BBC, because he was allowed to be a presenter on the BBC despite clearly being the chairman of The Spectator. So that's a brilliant illustration of the double standard. You would be on the other side of that illustration of that double standard. Your exchange with Robbie Gibb about one day I hope to be so impartial that I get a knighthood off Theresa May is a wonderful example of how bent the BBC had become by then. But there's an even better example. So if you put Andrew Neil here, there's a lad called Oscar Bentley in the book who you put here, who's a 25-year-old researcher on the Daily Politics, who after his first shift doing an entirely anodyne analysis of some claims Rishi Sunak had made about crime figures, finds himself in every right-wing newspaper the next day as a kid on his first shift, because his crime was to have posted a picture of his dog on a Facebook page called Dogs for Jeremy Corbyn. And that just shows that by then, we were lost in the sense of balance.
But you know what, James? In a way, just to sort of interject some of my own personal experience on this stuff, just on this point.
Yeah.
In a way, I don't actually blame, because I agree with you. I think that there was some pretty rank hypocrisy during that period. It was self-evident that basically, if you were at the BBC and you were clearly identified with the right or centre-right, that was fine. If there was any suspicion that you were on the left or centre-left, that was not fine. Yeah. And that reached its apogee during the kind of Johnson years at his pomp and whatever.
Yes.
But in a way, I don't really blame the Robbie Gibbs or even or any of these people. number 10 at that time. The people I would say ultimately, who wouldn't be in your book, is certain figures at the BBC who ought to have had more guts.
I completely agree.
And one of the problems is that some of these people allowed themselves to be bullied.
Yeah.
They allowed themselves to be bullied because these bullies did exactly what bullies do. They find the weak spot. And the weak spot was, you're a bunch of liberal metropolitan elites. And some of these people, not all by any means, but some of these people panicked. And they said, oh my God, they're right, we are. And we have to perform and be seen to not be.
Completely. Absolutely good. I mean, so I don't name names. I wasn't at the BBC long enough, and I don't know, it would have been my role to do so, but I do talk about the BBC institutionally as having been cowed and having been cowardly. I'd add one dimension to it, actually, that maybe because you've not been in the newspaper world like I have, that I do understand. If you're a senior manager at the BBC, you are invisible outside the BBC. But what the Mail would do, and Murdoch's media less so, is that they would threaten you with visibility. So it would be a picture of your house, perhaps, and the person who commissioned this, or the person who allows that, or the BBC Mandarin who... It doesn't have to happen, but once the threat is in your head, that those of us who present know that we're above the parapet, and there's a lot of smooth that we get that mitigates the rough. But if you're a panjandrum, if you're a management figure, Dacre and Murdoch would not hesitate to turn you into the story, to push you above the parapet. And I think I have some sympathy for having your judgment blurred by fear of that happening.
Oh yeah, it's a nightmare, and they don't stop, and it's relentless, and it's and it's awful. But I suppose in a way that's what bullies do.
And that's why I did have a couple of exchanges when I was taking calls from the Newsnight office asking me to take down tweets because some absolute Herbert had complained about them. I did have moments when I said, well, is there nobody there that can just tell these people to f*** off?
Or just ignore them?
Yeah.
What do you say? I mean, you know what the argument is. There are people, particularly on the right, they're not exclusively, they say that, you rail to some extent against this politics of polarisation, but that you're part of that process of polarisation, that you, on air day after day, don't see anything with nuance, that you have your particular tribe, your followers, and you're a sort of high priest of that. What do you say?
It's not true. I mean, it's obviously a useful stick to beat me with, but it's not true. I mean, especially recently, I've had the opposite problem. The problem post that 2019 cull is that there was nobody left on the Tory benches who was prepared to stand up and tell the truth. I think of Amber Rudd's twin resignation just before the 2019 election. First, because she took individual ministerial responsibility for something that hadn't actually happened on her watch, and second, because she wasn't prepared to watch all of these colleagues be sacrificed. So I'm perfectly capable of speaking warmly or with praise for conservative politicians, but the current generation are not. You can't.
Who's the Conservative you most admire, then?
Whatever.
Yeah.
Michael Heseltine.
Why?
Liverpool, Westland, up to a point. That clash of cultures whereby you either felt that the role of government was to help businesses, or you felt that the role of government was to stay as far away as possible from businesses in order to let the sort of law of the jungle apply. I think he's a brilliant communicator. I think he was a great leavener of Margaret Thatcher's extremities, and I think, and obviously here I do get tribal, I thought he was very, very powerful on Brexit as well. But I could speak warmly to you about John Major, up to a point. I could speak warmly to you about, obviously, Dominic Grieve and Rory Stewart, and plenty of Conservatives who were playing. I'll use that analogy again. They were playing on the same pitch for different teams, but abiding by the same rules, and that is what the book is about. That's one of the things that has broken, is that they're not the same rules anymore, and I'm not part of that polarisation, unless it's a polarisation of falsehood.
And what do you mean by the same rules?
What I mean is the standards. If you get caught lobbying, you take your punishment like a man. You don't have all your mates meeting at the Garrick Club, as happened with Owen Paterson, putting together a Save Owen Paterson Society.
This seems to me to be the crucial thing about you and your sort of journey on this, which is that it never struck me, and again I think this comes across in the book, it's not so much Brexit itself, right? I know obviously you pose it, but I think like many people, I think a lot of Remainers went on this journey, the sort of apathetic Remainers, at least in 2016, you became more, maybe radicalised is the wrong word, but certainly you became more ardent and strident about what happened after Brexit than at that moment. If we'd been sat here on the 22nd, 23rd of June 2016 talking about it, I suspect that James O'Brien then had his views, but wasn't necessarily the same James O'Brien who sat before me now.
No, well, I think I got conned. I think I got conned by the cowed BBC, by the monopoly, if you like, of the pro-Brexit print media. I presumed there were two sides to the argument, and that if it happened, it wouldn't be that bad. I was trying to be impartial at the time on the Beeb, even if I wasn't being that impartial on LBC. I was not a rabid.
But there were arguments for it, weren't there?
Exactly that. But what happened afterwards, and I think perhaps this only happened to me, is that I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people who were convinced that it was a brilliant thing to be doing. And because people sometimes ask, why don't they ring you anymore? And it's not for the obvious reasons. It's not because...
well, people say it's because you bullied them or you were unpleasant to them.
It could have been that, but it didn't stop them for 2 or 3 years. So that's probably not that.
Some of them enjoy it.
Yes, it's actually... They were doing a lap of honour. They were so high on victory that they never stopped to wonder what the prize was. So they would ring me in their hundreds, and I would ask them what the prize was. And none of them could tell me. And this is where I think radicalisation could be a fair word to use. That's where it started. Out of care and concern for them. As a radio phone-in host, you love your listeners. They are everything to you.
But wouldn't they say that was very patronising?
What is?
Saying that
contempt
you were
for the con, compassion for the con.
Well, concern for them, that maybe they felt legitimately and authentically.
Brilliant. And then they could tell me what they felt.
But surely some of them must have said to you, well, it's because I want to be a sovereign country, James. I think Britain should
make its own rules. And I'd ask them what sovereign meant.
Well, that they think that Britain should be able to make its own rules in the
So which rules is it that you're most looking forward to not having to obey anymore?
Well, for some people, as you know, it's not even just about it's not just about the actual practicalities of sovereignty. They have the feeling that they actually just want de jure, de facto sovereignty.
Which is an emotional argument and a powerful one. And if people made that, I had no choice but to go, fair enough, I believe you. But they didn't. They told me that they couldn't wait to be freed from the yoke of X. And I'd say, what's X? And they'd tell me that they couldn't wait to stop all the foreigners coming over. And I'd say, well, why? What is it? What impact has it had on your life? What is the negative that it would have on your life? And then as that ball starts rolling, another one joins in, which was... on immigration in particular, it was the phrase that I've come to say more often perhaps than any other, I don't mean you. This is the rhetoric of broken politics. It's here is a target that we are encouraging you to attack, whether it's the Tories or whether it's their friends in the media. At the moment, as you know, it's people who are on sickness benefit, coupled with people who are foreign workers now. It's not migrant unemployed. They were being demonised when I started on LBC. It's migrant employed now. You've got Mel Stride launching a pincer attack on foreigners who've got jobs and British people who haven't. But when you actually dig in to the victims of this con, if you dig into the people being mugged by this rhetoric, they will always say, oh, no, I don't mean you. And this is what I got immediately after Brexit. People ringing me to say, my mother-in-law voted for it. And I said, why? And she said, well, we've got to get rid of all these immigrants. And I'd say to my own mother-in-law, to the grandmother of my children, this is a caller talking, not me, I am an immigrant. I'm from Poland. I'm from Spain. Oh, I don't mean you. So who do you mean? And they mean the people that exist largely in the febrile imaginings of the characters in the book and their columnists and their key consiglieres. And that is not patronising, because that is saying someone has lied to you, and that's not fair. It's not patronising to tell someone that they've been lied to if you can prove that it's true.
What would you describe your politics as now? Are you a liberal? Are you a social democrat?
Wistful.
Socialist? Wistful?
I'm wistful.
On the left? On the centre? I mean, people talk about centrist dads. Do you consider yourself a centrist dad? It's a disparaging term.
I don't think it's a disparaging term.
No, you
I love being a dad. And you know, generally, depending on where the Overton window is, being in the centre is usually someone has to be in the centre in order for either side.
Although you're not in the centre in the sort of British media terms.
No, God no. Well, that's mad. I should be.
Well, yes, I don't think your politics is that different in terms of the population overall, but in British media terms, your politics would certainly be nowhere near that.
It's insane, that. I mean, when they write their books about the new elite or about the establishment, and people like Farage talk about the establishment and how... And I stopped when I was writing the introduction to make a list of everybody who had a decent-sized platform in the British media to put forward essentially centrist, never mind left-wing, essentially centrist thinking. There wasn't anyone. Because you've got Gary Lineker and Carol Vorderman, but Gary does it on his Twitter account. He doesn't do it on Match of the Day.
But the conservative right's analysis of modern politics is that virtually every modern British institution is bedeviled by liberalism and cultural liberalism.
I know it is. And you ask for proof.
Well, I think this is one of the different... I think this is where the debate gets confused, which is I am willing to go along with the idea that a lot of modern... In the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of modern political institutions, the judiciary, the university and so on, I think there's no doubt that you can argue that they have become more... The individuals involved, because they are graduates and they're more likely to be graduates and so on, they probably have more cosmopolitan liberal views. There is a difference with that and then acting partially.
Yes.
And that is the thing that is always elided.
Well,
and so that is where the proof comes from. So I suspect the judiciary, for example, which would have once been extremely conservative, is less conservative now in terms of the individual politics.
Because universities are less conservative
Indeed
now.
so. And so that is true. And it's perfectly entitled for conservatives to feel, maybe they want to feel aggrieved by that, or they think there should be more actual conservatives in these institutions. Fair enough. But then there's the next stage of the argument, which is say, what's the impact?
Therefore you can't be trusted.
Yes, I think that's the difference.
And that's insidious.
And that is insidious.
That's Dacreism in a nutshell.
Finally, can I just talk to you a little bit about talk radio?
Yeah, cool.
And the art of it.
What do you want to know?
Well, I was going to say, I've started this new Sunday show, so I need a few tips. Because I think it is a really interesting... It's just a really interesting art. And I think it is one of the hardest gigs, really, in broadcasting, at least at LBC, because unlike at most radio, most broadcasting, there's no script. Maybe the odd cue here and there, but generally speaking, it's 3, 2, 1, over to you, Lewis, over to you, James, and that's it. You take it away, and you take that, as we've already said, to the nth degree, because your opening monologues on your show can go on for 10, 20. What's the record, James?
I think I once got all the way to the 10:30, which is bad for advertisers. Obviously, you can't do this on a regular basis.
And you've done it for 20 years.
Yes.
What do you love about it? Because you must love it to have done it for 20 years. What do you love about it? Because there are some people in the media who are quite sniffy about it.
I know.
As you know.
More fool them,
More fool them. Why do you love it?
Look at the numbers. I love the immediacy of the contact. There is nothing like it. It doesn't matter how sniffy you are. The people who might be sniffy about it will be the same people who claim that we're out of touch or that we don't know what's going on, whereas in fact I am on the end of the phone.
For 3 hours every
day. 5 days a week for 3 hours a day. And as was demonstrated during the period we talked about immediately post-Brexit, you can ring me if you despise me. You can ring me if you
And they'll put them through.
And you're on. You're probably front of the queue as long as you're sort of coherent. And that's not the reason to love it, that element of it, but that is an element of the thing that makes it so lovable. It's the intimacy, the immediacy of the contact. And journalism really... That's why we spoke yesterday, and I don't think you thought I was being serious when I asked you, what do you do when you get to somewhere like Tbilisi in the middle of protest? How do you get a story? Because I've never been a foreign correspondent. I've barely ever been on a doorstep. But actually, I thought afterwards, you do what I do on the radio. You talk to as many people as you possibly can about the subject that's under discussion, and you knit together for a tapestry of insight, a tapestry of perspectives, and that tapestry then will be helpful to everybody, including you. Now, obviously, I find it hard to resist the urge to have the biggest thread in the tapestry, but it's still a tapestry. It's still got loads of other bits.
Trying to impose order on the chaos.
Yeah, exactly that. Trying to make sense of stuff. And the line I always remember, the magic for me, happened very early, about as long into the job as you are now, when a previous management at LBC brought in a consultant, and I'm normally, certainly my experiences on newspapers, I was very sceptical about consultants, I'd always thought, well, go and do the job if you're that good at it then. But of course the best ones have. And she just said to me, what you need to do is remember that you're talking to one person. I think Wogan had this.
It was Wogan's line, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah. I think Wogan had this, but you still hear people saying folks, or everybody out there, or ladies and gentlemen. I'd never do that. If I do that, you'll notice, because I'm always thinking that I have the privilege of being in the passenger seat of your car, or I might be in the corner of your kitchen. I might even be in bed with you. I have this enormous, intimate privilege of being able to talk with you every day. And it is talking with you, even if you never reply, because you don't ring in. You're replying you're replying in your head, and that, I'm never going to get bored of that, ever.
When I said that I told someone earlier that I was interviewing you, the thing that they wanted me to ask you is, do you prepare the monologues? To what extent you prepare them?
Not even a little bit.
It just
not even a
comes
time.
out.
Happily, there's a room full of people upstairs who can confirm that at 5 to 10 in the morning, I won't even be 100% sure what subject.
And you're never worried about, because you might be going till 25 past 10.
No, I'm never worried. I think out loud, Lewis.
They always strike me as a bit of a sermon, really.
They can be a sermon. I mean, I hope in a good way.
You're kind of liberal. You always strike me as a bit of a sort of lay preacher for liberalism.
Yes, except that on the days when I'm working stuff out live on air. I mean, the two things I love the most in terms of monologue as opposed to dialogue, the two things I love the most are the penny drop moments when I actually go, oh my God, that's why they've done that, or they don't happen very often. Like actually a moment of clarity. But I also really love the kind of silences. I love the moments where you sort of feel your cogs whirring inside and you realise that you're wrong about something. So you can have a moment of clarity in a positive sense and a moment of clarity in a negative sense. But I'm incredibly lucky to be able to just do that, and it works. If it didn't, it's a commercial radio station. If it didn't work, I wouldn't be here.
How do you deal with, and do you think it's becoming a bigger problem? Because it's something I've thought about in a relatively short time that I've done it, and I think it's become particularly acute since October 7th, which is misinformation and conspiracy. Yeah. Because our politics has definitely become more conspiratorial in recent years, and you can just tell that and it's always it's a difficult balance, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you're inviting people to ring in.
Yes.
And you're inviting them to give their views. And then sometimes people can just be wrong, and that's, their opinion can be wrong, or you can think it's misguided. And then there's a spectrum, isn't there, to full on, sometimes either conspiracy or not. How do you deal with it?
I get much on the radio. It's more on social media. And I've recently found myself adjacent to the kind of insane conspiracy that I thought was confined to the right wing or to anti-vaxxers. And it has been a very sobering experience to realise that many, many more people than I would have thought were susceptible to the idea that there's a secret hands pulling levers of influence and cabals of people making secret decisions that the public will never be told about. On air, it's old and it's new. It's new and it's old, isn't it? So, I'm trying to think what the first... Back in the day, it was probably people claiming that September the 11th was an inside job. And the problem you always have, is that this is all they do. So when they come out with stuff about girders or aviation fuel, they sound like they know what they're talking about.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And of course, you don't know these specific details because you're on air 15 hours
and then you get messages saying, Lewis, James, why didn't you say,
So the determination of people to believe things that aren't true is what we're talking about. And that is not new, but the access they have to validation, up to and including now television channels upon which you're allowed to punt these ludicrous conspiracy theories. So social media has leached back into more traditional media, but it is still an ancient problem, not a new one. The determination to believe things that are not true. And the way I work sometimes is on cui bono. What do you get from this? What do you gain from this? And in the case of the ringleaders, it's obvious. It's influence, it's prestige, it's jobs, it's money. But what does Joe Public get from it? From believing that the vaccine is designed to harm him, or believing... And the more you talk about that on air, without necessarily talking to the subscribers to the conspiracy theories, the more light you can bring into the conversation. You just have to hope that some of them are listening.
Still be doing it next 20 years?
20 years is a long time, but I don't think this will be my last election.
James, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Liz.
Pleasure.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.